Hi everybody. On the spiritual path, it's often recommended that we ask ourselves the question, who am I? Now obviously this question has the intention of getting us to look beyond the limiting identities. Often when we first ask this question, as many people do, whether on the spiritual path or not, we tend to want to put ourselves into fixed categories. Maybe I do this profession, or I'm a parent, or a child of a parent, or I'm really good at this, or I'm really bad at that, and these kind of things. The problem with this is that it tends to fix reality into a certain constricted box that we put ourselves in. And so there's nothing wrong with acknowledging these things, there's nothing wrong with stepping into certain roles at times, but then if we make our identity based on those things, then that limits us to a degree. And so when we're invited to step beyond that, when we're invited to be a different way in our lives, often there can be a subconscious blockage of that because we are already identified with this or that. So this is kind of the first thing to step beyond in terms of the question, who am I, in terms of identity. But then we're faced with a second challenge, a much more subtle challenge, we can say. We could call this the spiritual identity. The challenge with this is that the spiritual identity is built up when we study spirituality, when we get into the practices, when we start to experience the blissful and joyful and expansive states as a result of these practices, as a result of these beliefs or this way of being. And so there can be a subtle identity, a subtle fixation on that. And what this means is it's very easy to replicate how we believe the soul should be. So for example, we see that spontaneity is a natural aspect, a natural expression of the soul. However, it could be then that we make spontaneity an intentional part of our lives, and as soon as it becomes an intention, as soon as it becomes I'm going to behave this way now because there's a subtle belief that that's the way you should be when you're in the soul, you override the actual natural flow of the soul. And so there's a lot of very subtle traps, we can say, in the spiritual identity, where you subconsciously know how the soul behaves, and therefore you mimic it in some ways. Another example of this, which is very common, I've found, is the question of love, the question of compassion. People have an idea that the soul is unconditionally loving, which of course is true. However, there tends to be then a fixation on behaving in that way. It's when you make the way of being a fixed behavior that it becomes a problem. You say, well, I'm going to approach this situation in a more loving way. And then the mind says, well, what is a more loving way? Well, I could be more compassionate towards them. Well, I could be more open to their opinions. These kind of things. I could be more understanding. All absolutely great things. However, there are many, many aspects to unconditional love. And some of them are also less soft than the compassion, the understanding. Some of them can also be pushing a person to reach their potential, for example, or telling them the cold, hard truth that they need to hear. And so love is a very broad definition, and so if we try and define ourselves by love, we limit ourselves again. And so back to the question, who am I? If we are none of these things, then what are we? The answer would be a flow of consciousness which emanates from the source and flows down through the body-mind, which can call this flow of consciousness the soul, acts through the body-mind, and then flows back to the source again. Now, of course, to step into this, we have to step beyond a fixed way of being. We have to feel into the moment what's invited to us, what's invited of us. And a good question you can ask yourself when contemplating the question, who am I? Is, what does my energy naturally do when I'm being my authentic self? What effect does it have on the environment? Is it grounding, for example? Or is it uplifting? Or is it cleansing? These kind of things. What natural effect do you have on the world around you? And this is a good way of getting to know your energy, because each soul is unique. Each soul has its own gifts. And so this is a good way of getting to know that without identifying with a fixed pattern of behavior. Until ultimately, of course, even this falls away. In meditation, in our daily practice, where we touch the void of presence, that part of us which does not need anything to be a certain way, that part of us which is beyond our experience of the physical, of the emotional, of the mental. That part of us which is so close to the source that it's barely in relativity and separation at all. It feels like nothing and also everything. It's difficult to describe unless, of course, you've kind of had that experience yourself, and then you'll know what I'm talking about. We can call this non-identified presence, which is, of course, who we are at our essence. And so if we can let that flow through the body-mind in the ways I've explained, then we become a connected being, connected with the source, letting it flow through in the way that we're being with the world, in the way that we're expressing ourselves authentically, and then bringing that back again to the source through witnessing our expression and how that ripples out and affects the world. I trust you found this exploration insightful, and any questions, please feel free to get in touch. I'm always happy to engage to talk to people. Thank you very much.